Thank you very much, everybody, for coming today to this talk. It is an honor to participate in this webinar series. There's been fantastic speakers so far, so I would like to thank the organizers once again for inviting me to participate in this. And as you all know, because you've registered today, we're going to be discussing the interpreter's gender in community interpreting settings and its potential significance. Before I go fully into this topic, maybe a little bit of background to explain how I arrived at this topic. First, I studied translation and interpreting at the Autonomous University of Madrid in Spain. I did my bachelor's there, and at that point already, when I was writing my bachelor's thesis, I did a comparative analysis of the translations of Die Leiden des jungen Werthers by Goethe into Spanish and into English, and I was focusing in particular on politeness and terms of endearment and how those resources, those linguistic resources, were used depending on the gender of the characters and how that then played out in the translation. So this was the first approach to gender-related topics in translation studies, at this point still translation. But then I moved to Scotland. I did my master's in interpreting at Hertford University. There I was trained both as a conference interpreter and a public service interpreter. And when it was time to do my dissertation, I was intrigued to also explore maybe gender-related issues in interpreting. But then I somehow assumed there would be so much research already conducted on this topic, on this area. And I remember very clearly having a conversation with some of my lecturers, my professors there, and then being like, actually, no, there's very little research conducted on this area. So I thought, fantastic, because then there's so much I can do. And I did a little experiment, basically looking at how conference interpreters deal with gender-neutral inclusive language. And the language pair at that time was English and Spanish. And that really sparked already a deeper interest into all the possibilities that exist when looking at gender-related topics in interpreting studies. But then I moved back to Spain. I worked as a translator and an interpreter for an organization for some time. And eventually I decided that I actually wanted to pursue a PhD. And I moved here to Helsinki and started doing my dissertation at the University of Helsinki. As Jan said, my dissertation deals with gender, in particular the significance of the interpreter's gender in healthcare settings. So at this point, I wanted to look at community interpreting because I thought community interpreting actually presents certain characteristics that make the study of gender-related issues very, very interesting. So let's maybe start with that. Why gender in community interpreting? First of all, we are talking about very sensitive settings, right? We're talking about healthcare, we're talking about schools, we're talking about social work and so on. These are contexts where very delicate topics, very delicate matters are discussed. Things that might be actually quite difficult to talk about. And on top of that, if we think about this context, these are also the kinds of situations where we can imagine actually gender topics coming up, either implicitly or explicitly. If we think about discussing sexual and reproductive health, if we think about, for instance, in the context of social work, if we think about family dynamics and family issues, if we think about transgender people receiving healthcare, gender violence cases, and so on. So there are many topics that can become related to gender that can become topicalized, so quite explicitly. But also implicitly, there are other topics that might not relate directly to gender, but gender dynamics might influence the way these topics are approached and discussed. So in that sense, it's quite interesting to look at this in community interpreting. On top of that, we also have the fact that power dynamics in interpreter-mediated encounters in community interpreting settings are quite complex. So we usually have, of course, the service provider who represents an institution, usually, and they have the capacity to help the service user, or also the ability to provide certain services or to make certain decisions that can influence or impact the service user's life, sometimes quite dramatically. Then the service user, in this case, when we are talking about interpreter-mediated encounters, will, of course, have the added barrier that they do not speak the language of the institution, at least not fluently enough to be able to go through the system without the help of an interpreter, without the services of an interpreter. And then we have the interpreter, who sometimes might be in-house, and in that case might be aligned with the institution, and some other times it's a freelancer and comes through an agency, it's an external party. And of course, we all know that the interpreter does have a lot of power in the sense that they do understand everything that's going on. They have access to the tellings of both parties, and they can also communicate with them directly and have a big role to play in the meaning making of the interaction. If we add to that as well the fact that this is multicultural communication, and when we think about gender, of course, the way we think about gender, our understanding of it, our gender ideologies, and also the way we perceive gender roles, all of these things might be influenced by culture. I will not say determined, because of course, when we go to the individuals might experience these things in very different ways, but at least there's this influence that we cannot ignore. And in community interpreting settings and in these kinds of interpreter-mediated encounters, this is something that's always present. Then to add to that, we have also the fact that when we think about community interpreting, the majority of professionals are women. Of course, this can depend also on the language pair, and also in certain places there might be more variation. But if we think of about the profession as a whole, then it's mostly female professionals, or there is a majority of women in the field. And this is interesting also in the sense that if maybe there is a requirement or there is a request that an interpreter of a particular gender is provided for a particular situation, this might not always be possible. We know the availability of interpreters overall is sometimes quite limited. And lastly, also important to remark that how we see the potential significance of gender in interpreter-mediated encounters also has a lot to do with how we view the interpreter's role. So as we know, some time ago, traditionally the interpreter was portrayed as this invisible linguistic conduit. But in the last few decades, the literature in community interpreting has repeatedly stated that interpreters are actually co-participants in interaction, that of course they are participating in interaction under certain rules, right? But still they are participants in interaction, and they are influencing the meaning making. They are very much involved in the meaning making. And also they co-construct the interaction together with the other parties. So when we see the interpreter as such, then it is not a crazy idea to imagine that their social background may have some sort of significance or influence. But let's now look at some of the literature that has been conducted so far, particularly in regards to the interpreter's gender in community interpreting. There is not a lot of research conducted on this area, as I was saying. There is more than what I'm referencing here, but I want to focus on this research because it has to do with what I'm going to present today. So first, when we look at some literature on healthcare interpreting, we see that some studies suggest that in certain cases, the interpreter's gender may influence the client's ability to discuss certain topics. So basically influencing how comfortable clients are when discussing some matters. This is nuanced. We will look into this later on, but there is this suggestion that appears recurrently in the studies that have been conducted so far. Another thing is this relationship between gender and culture in interpreter-mediated encounters, both from the point of view of interpreters maybe being able to bridge some gaps, some cultural gaps related to gender in interpreter-mediated encounters, and also in the sense of culture determining certain taboos that come into play when we are talking about different gender dynamics in interaction. And lastly, I also wanted to come back to this idea of the fact that there is a gender imbalance in the profession. There are a majority of female interpreters. And the impact this may potentially have on the status of the profession. So there is sociological research conducted on other feminized professions such as nursing or teaching, social work. And it has been proven that actually the fact that most of the professionals are women does have an impact on the profession, on how it is viewed, on the status it has, and also that there might be certain gender stereotypes that are somehow applied to the profession as a whole. But it's also important to say that a lot of this research, of course, is qualitative, which is to be expected because it's an emerging field. But this also means that these results cannot be generalized, right? So that's why I wanted to look further into this topic, conduct my own also qualitative research on this, and see if new themes, new topics emerge, and sort of survey what kinds of phenomena we could be looking into. So if we actually go into, sorry, I don't know what's happening to my throat. If we go into the study I'm going to be discussing today, this is this qualitative survey among community interpreters. And I will take a sip of water. Here I was focusing on the interpreters' perceptions, and the reason why I wanted to do that was basically because interpreters as professionals will have a unique perspective of what is going on. They also have a unique understanding of the dynamics in interpreter-mediated encounters. So I wanted to start with that. Of course, it's also very important to gather more data from the point of view of the clients and also from the point of view of service providers. But this study is part of my doctoral dissertation, which focuses on healthcare interpreting, but today, well, this study actually takes into account community interpreters as a whole. And as you can see, this data set, this data that I will be presenting today, has been already analyzed in an article published in the journal Interpreting. And in this article, I go quite deeply into the data, so it's an in-depth analysis. Today, I will present a more general analysis of the data. I will bring up some of the themes that are touched on in that article. Most of the examples I will be presenting are not in that article. Some are. In those cases, it will be clearly referenced, so you know what is what and from where it's taken. But this is another resource that if you're interested in the topic, you can consult. Now, moving on to the actual data. So the main research question when I was approaching this topic was how do public service interpreters perceive the significance of their gender in their professional practice? There's a typo there on the slide, it doesn't matter. So I collected data from Finland, the UK, and Spain. Because of this was a multilingual survey, so the survey form was available in Finnish, in English, and in Spanish. There were 9 questions. It was qualitative, as I was saying. Some of them were directly open-ended questions. Some of them were multi-choice. Some of them were Likert scales. But after each one of those questions, there would always be an open-ended field that was mandatory. So participants always had to provide extra information on their answers. And because of this, the data ended up being quite rich. I received 95 responses. It is important to highlight that the number of participants per country is a bit or quite uneven. I didn't manage to get a lot of responses from Spain. It was really hard to reach participants in Spain, and this might have to do with the differences in the community interpreting market in these 3 countries. But for the purpose of today's presentation, this is not so relevant in that I'm going to be discussing the data set generally, and the themes that appear in the data actually are very similar across the 3 countries. It's also the case that there's an imbalance when it comes to the gender of the participants. So there are 82 women who participated, 11 men, and 2 non-binary participants. And this basically reflects the reality of the profession. As we were mentioning, there is a majority of women in the field. So no more comments on that. But of course, the perspective we're getting is marked predominantly by women. Also, something I was really happy about was that the data are quite linguistically diverse in that 30 languages are represented. And something that I think is great about this data set is that it gathers responses from both spoken and sign language interpreters. And to my knowledge, no other study on the significance of the interpreter's gender has collected data from both sign language and spoken language interpreters. And they really made it much richer. Like the whole data set becomes much richer because of this. Around half of the UK sample actually is comprised of sign language interpreters. And that, in my opinion, was fantastic. Something I want to mention before I move forward with the actual findings and the analysis is that I want to mention that participants discuss gender and sex quite interchangeably. The line between the 2 are quite blurry in the examples that you're going to be seeing. And this also is recognized in gender studies, that the line between these 2 concepts can be quite blurry. Then I also want to say that I do not have a binary perspective on gender, but the participants in their answers mostly discuss the categories of women and men. So these are the categories we're going to be discussing today. It's not an imposition from me onto the data, but it just arises from the data. And lastly, because it's a multilingual survey, some of the examples that are not originally in English have been translated by me into English, just so that it's accessible to everybody here today. And without further ado, maybe we can now go into the data. So let's start with some descriptive statistics. This is one of the Likert scales, and the statement that participants were presented with was, "My gender is relevant to my professional practice as an interpreter." And here we see that 69% of participants agreed with this statement to at least some extent, right? We see here that the most chosen option was somewhat agree, followed by strongly agree. We also see some participants disagree to different degrees. What we're going to be looking at today, what we're going to be examining today is the reasons, the justifications that they provided to support these views, right? So why the interpreters who believe that the interpreter's gender is significant, why do they think that? And the same for those who didn't agree with this statement. But this is already, it already provides a general view on the opinions of this matter or about this matter. Then here we also see that participants were asked about the settings where they thought gender was important in community interpreting. And healthcare is quite clearly highlighted as quite a significant setting in this respect. Not only in this question, but also when one looks at the open-ended responses, healthcare is mentioned over 200 times, so very much highlighted. Also, other fields were highlighted. Social work we see here was also mentioned. In the open-ended responses, we also have legal settings and so on, but healthcare clearly very much highlighted. But now let's look at the open-ended responses. As I was saying, what we're going to do now is first look at the factors that the participants highlighted or indicated as the reasons why the interpreter's gender is relevant in community interpreting. And then also we will move on to look at the same thing, but about or from those interpreters that thought it was irrelevant or it is irrelevant. When we look at the themes, there is a lot that comes from the data, actually. As I was mentioning, it is quite rich, but today we're going to focus just on some themes that either became very, very recurrent or also are just, in my opinion, very interesting aspects to consider moving forward, also in research on gender-related matters in community interpreting. But let's have a look. Let's start with the reflections on the significance of the interpreter's gender. And here I chose this image because that's a little bit how it felt to work with the data. There were so many different aspects that participants discussed and mentioned, and just having to tease out all of this information to come up with something that would kind of make sense. The first thing that maybe is worth mentioning is that participants were very much oriented to the client's preferences. So they basically said that the interpreter's gender is significant because of clients' preferences. And these might be exactly the first thing that comes to mind if we start thinking, why could the interpreter gender be relevant, right? This might be the first idea that comes to mind. When they talk about this, they're mostly thinking about how the interpreter's gender, their own gender, can impact how comfortable the client feels. So here we have a couple of examples. I will present examples for each theme. When it comes to these, the first example says, I feel I am able to build a trusting foundation with clients as a result of my own personality, but I cannot deny that being a woman is a huge advantage when working with many women who, for various reasons, are not comfortable in the presence of men. And then we have another example. Here, the interpreter says, with women in healthcare settings, they can feel more comfortable with a woman when, for example, having to remove clothing or talk about sexual health issues. So again, these are reasons that may quite quickly come to mind when we think about this topic. And also, as we mentioned, or as I mentioned already earlier, this is also represented in the existing literature on this topic. On the topic of gender mismatches or gender matches between the interpreter's gender and the client's gender, there is something to say for sure. So when participants talk about this, they're usually talking about how it is beneficial that in certain circumstances, in certain situations, there is a gender match. This is maybe the most recurrent trend in the data, that they say in certain situations, not in every case, of course, but in certain contexts, gender matches might be beneficial, sometimes even necessary. They also talk about situations where a gender mismatch had a very much detrimental impact on the development of the situation. Example number 3 focuses on this sort of beneficial aspect of gender matching. So here the interpreter said, in women's healthcare settings, women often feel more comfortable with a female interpreter. The same goes for men. It was common practice for interpreting agencies to match female patients with female interpreters and male patients with male interpreters. Something to note here as well is that it's a common practice here for some agencies, as this interpreter says, to sort of do this automatically, maybe not really taking into account the client's own preferences, but just doing this by default, which is something to reflect on, I think. But then there were also some cases where interpreters reported that regardless of the setting, the topic, the clients had never really been uncomfortable because of their gender. It hasn't really mattered, right? And there were a couple of cases where interpreters actually reported that sometimes a mismatch is preferred. And here we have an example of that. Here the interpreter reported, female interpreters are also requested for male clients sometimes if the issue is related to intimate matters. A woman's presence may soften the atmosphere, for example, during a police interview, if both the interviewer and the interviewee are men. The same happens in very delicate and difficult situations where the presence of empathetic people is necessary. And here, important to note, maybe apart from this issue of the gender mismatch being requested actually by the client, is that there's this mention of women softening the atmosphere in some situations, or in the end, also this maybe implicit association of empathy with women, which hints already at maybe some gender stereotypes or gender biases. And I'm going to be talking about this later on in the presentation. But already something that comes up here. Moving on, another topic that was very recurrent was this issue of relatability and rapport, which basically relates to the ability of the interpreter and the client, the ability of them to relate to each other based on shared experiences that are related to gender, to their gender. And that this can also make it easier for them to establish rapport. Let's look at the examples. The first example says, in certain appointments with women, for example, gynecological appointments or appointments where their children are present, as a woman, I have a better understanding of the situation, we can understand, and more empathy. So here it is discussed from the point of view that as an interpreter, when I share same gender as the client, in certain situations, when I've had experiences that are similar, I can actually understand better what the situation of the client is. And also I can have more empathy, I can feel empathy towards them. But there's also this other point of view that is very much present in example number 6. Here the interpreter says that in a woman-only setting where sensitive or woman-specific issues are being discussed, I believe that the gender match enables people to feel, whether it is actually the case or not, that they are more understood by the other. So here's not so much whether the interpreter can understand more or not because of their gender and this sort of gender match. It's more just like the client feeling that they are being understood. It doesn't have to be the case, but just feeling that way. And that may be also contributing to this establishment of rapport. Another very interesting aspect that comes from this data set is the intersectionality of gender with other social factors. And this was something very interesting in the data that I think was particularly influenced by the fact that there were so many sign language interpreters in the UK sample. Let's look at a couple examples that basically deal with two different factors. The first one is focused on this intersection between deafness and gender. Here, the interpreter tells that one high-profile deaf man preferred to have an incompetent male interpreter rather than a competent female interpreter for this reason. Vocal representation of his masculine presence was more important to him than the accuracy of the content. This issue of vocal representation is brought up quite recurrently in the responses provided by sign language interpreters in two main ways. So one of these ways is that when there is a gender mismatch between the interpreter and the client, the voice of the interpreter doesn't match the gender of the client, and this can cause the hearing party to feel a bit confused as to who is talking, because what they are hearing doesn't really match what they are seeing. But then this, the other aspect that is mentioned is basically what appears in this example, that actually voice is another element of gender representation, right? It's another element, another aspect that can be used to index gender. So deaf clients have the right to have a voice that matches their gender, if that is important to them. And when discussing this topic, there was also sometimes explicit, sometimes more implicit mentions of maybe matters of status. Also coming into play here, relating to the intersection or the connection of ableism and sexism when working in these sign language interpreting encounters. Then another factor here, in example number 8, we are looking at an example dealing with the LGBT community. Here, the interpreter, who was a non-binary participant, says, "My gender has been positive in healthcare for trans patients or LGBT couples, as I am aware of the current terminology and won't risk offense in the same way as some peers that are not in the community may do." And here what we are seeing basically is that the clients might feel more comfortable just being reassured that the interpreter belongs to the community. And in this case, the interpreter belongs to the community because of their gender identity. Belonging to the community makes it more likely that they will be aware of important aspects to take into consideration. They would be, as the participant mentions, aware of the terminology, and these will put patients at ease. And this, of course, doesn't mean that somebody who doesn't belong to the community cannot be aware. Of course, I'm sure there are many interpreters out there who do not belong to the community, but make a point of staying informed and being aware of all of these aspects. But clients might have had negative experiences before with other interpreters. In the data, there was also this example of a transgender patient that had actually been misgendered by interpreters in the past. So this might put clients at ease. So another example of this intersection, in this case, of gender identity and belonging to the LGBTQ+ community. A topic that I've already discussed in that example at the beginning, but that we will look into further now, is gender biases. So again, this idea that there might be some expectations or assumptions based on a person's gender, right? So mostly based on gender stereotypes. Because we saw that previous example, now I'm going to show you another one. Here, the interpreter reports people generally seem better able to bond with females, trusting in their empathy. Females are widely seen as more caring and communicative. So here we have empathy, we have been caring, and we have been more communicative. And all of these things basically are traits, characteristics that belong to the gender stereotype of women and women's personality. And this is actually marked also in this response. So the interpreter is very much saying they are widely seen as such, doesn't really mean that they are. But these stereotypes do exist, whether they actually correspond with reality or not, and is something that is present in the profession, which again, I think is important, or at least interesting to reflect on when we consider that many or the majority of professionals in community interpreting are women. If we take this one step further, we actually move on to instances of sexism. So situations that the participants report where they have actually not been taken seriously as professionals, or they've been put into in situations that are really uncomfortable, inappropriate, and so on, based on their gender. And here we also have a couple of examples. The first one says, in some cases, a male worker has had to intervene because they, referring to the client, were not listening to me, nor letting me interpret. So that's obviously quite unfortunate that you are not even able to perform the task you are hired to do, to do your work as you normally would. Another example here that I think is also very interesting. Here the interpreter says, I conduct myself professionally at work, so my gender should not have any importance, but unfortunately it does. In some situations, a male client who was clearly older than me spoke inappropriately to me, or some clients might just assume that I do not know how to do my job because I am a woman or because I am young. So again, here not being taken seriously as a professional, even though she is clearly stating that she really does everything she can to be very professional at work, or sometimes has been addressed in a way that it's not appropriate. Unfortunately, there are more examples of this in the data, and it's something again to consider, especially because of the gender imbalance in the profession. Sexism is a phenomenon that is present in society, and so we cannot pretend that this cannot touch interpreting, or that this would never become relevant or become a significant thing to consider in interpreter-mediated encounters. But moving on to the other side of things, right? So reflections on the insignificance of the interpreter's gender. What kind of reasons participants provided to support this idea that the interpreter's gender is actually not relevant. And here, the reasons are much more straightforward. There are two, which are professionalism and skill. So basically, participants are talking about how if you are professional, if you know how to do your work, and if you have the right skills, if you have good interpreting skills, good communication skills, then those are the two things that matter, and other factors, including gender, not so important. Let's look at the examples. Here we have example number 12. Here the interpreter is stating, I don't think gender should be an issue as we can all do the same job within our skill sets. So here focusing on skill. And then this other example, which I think is a very interesting example. Here the interpreter says, there might be certain factors that facilitate conversation, but if we follow our codes of ethics, like any other professional would, interpreting, precisely consists of translating or interpreting faithfully without getting involved at all, almost like machines. So gender doesn't have that much to do with it. So here we have the reference to codes of ethics and behaving professionally, being a professional. Interesting as well, I think, is that it appears that this interpreter has the notion of interpreters as conduits. Here we say that we see that interpreters are compared to machines, right? So this invisible linguistic conduit model seems to be present in this answer. And this is interesting because there's also the counterpart to this in the data. So there is maybe this discussion ultimately about the interpreter's visibility. And by visibility here, I don't mean the physical visibility of the interpreter, but again, this notion of the interpreter as being a co-participant, as having the capacity and agency to influence the encounter in some way. And here we have an example from another participant. This participant said, how we behave is connected to our identity, and our identity cannot be ignored in the process of interpreting. We no longer work in a conduit mode, therefore who we are is acknowledged. So here maybe is this idea that there are certain aspects that transcend professionalism, and also that there are factors that we just cannot control. So our identity, as what this participant is saying, just cannot be ignored, and it is potentially going to be acknowledged. But what do we make of all of this? First, I would say that we've seen in the data in this sample that 69% of participants believe that their gender is significant in their practices as interpreters, at least to some extent. We've also seen through the example that actually the significance of the interpreter's gender is highly context dependent. So we are not going to say in every single context and every single encounter, it will have this very marked significance, but it's very context dependent. We also saw that there are many different factors actually that can influence how significant it becomes. All of this creates this situation where I don't think we can come up with a perfect formula that will tell us exactly when and how the interpreter's gender becomes significant. There are many factors to consider, and because of that, I think the data suggests that we need to assess and address these issues on a case-by-case basis. Another thing that seems to transpire from the data is that whether interpreters see their gender as significant or not might also have to do with this idea of the interpreter as co-participant, or maybe this more conduit model. There's this invisibility or visibility dichotomy maybe playing out in the background of this discussion. And we saw that those who believe it is not significant rely mostly on these arguments of professionalism and skill, which of course we can all agree are fundamental. They are the basis, right, to the job. And of course, they're also essential in the sense that they will help navigate gender-related issues. Those things cannot be denied. But the data also shows, the examples we've seen also show that there is more to it. There are other things to consider that fall outside of the realm of just professionalism and skills. And in the data, these positions might look quite opposing views, but I actually consider them to be very much complementary. So of course, we need professionalism and skills, but we also need to take a step further. We need awareness, we need knowledge, we need reflection when it comes to gender-related issues, so that then we are able to navigate them properly. And in a way that is effective and that contributes to the interaction in a positive way. Both aspects can be very much addressed in interpreter training, and this could be quite beneficial. The same way interpreter training discusses ethics in interpreting through various methods, I think it would be beneficial to include conversations about social factors, including gender, gender-related issues, situations, and also important this reflection on our own biases, this acknowledgement that other people may also have biases, and so on and so forth. By providing interpreters with tools to handle these situations and gender-related issues in community interpreting settings, they would just be better equipped to navigate those issues in their professional practice. They would be very prepared to address them when they become significant or relevant. And that can only have a positive impact on all the parties involved, can only have a beneficial impact on the outcomes, or beneficial outcomes for all the parties involved. And I think that's all from me now. There are some references here. Just also to acknowledge that this study was supported by an EduFi fellowship granted by the Finnish National Agency for Education. And now I would just like to thank you all once again for listening to the presentation. And if you have any questions or comments, they are very much welcome. Thank you very much.